Good morning, Dawg Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. Picked a great day to be with us here. We have got a kind of an unsung member of the Georgia football roster who is really showcasing some rare athleticism. Could this mean something for this fall? Well, honestly, we don't know. But he was already kind of an interesting prospect before this new information came to light. We'll tell you about this later on. We think you'll like that, especially if you happen to be watching on video here today. We are going to look back on, and it takes deft hands to do this now, in sort of lesser hands, sort of a lesser broadcast. This would have the potential to go wrong. But we are actually going to look back on a very unpleasant moment in Georgia's football history and tell the tale of why that actually became a very important part of the origin story of the Georgia success that we are experiencing right now. This will be good because we are capable of making that happen. That comes up today. And off the top, I would say that one of the most frequent criticisms of this current age we often hear from fans, and we've been hearing it for more than just a couple of years. This has been sort of long-standing for quite some time. One of the most frequent criticisms we hear from fans about the current landscape of college football, that criticism may be about to be rendered moot, and a very unexpected benefit to fans from the recent changes in college athletics could be about to be enjoyed. What am I talking about? Well, I'll tell you that, and I'll also explain why that also dovetails into what was kind of a nice 24 hours for Georgia recruiting yesterday. So all of that is coming up. Without further ado, we'll get it started. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We've talked this week, and we've talked now for quite some time, that college football fans have gotten used to just sort of enduring a lot of change. And sometimes it seems like that change has sort of changed for the worse, and perhaps sometimes it possibly is. But every now and then there can be a pleasant surprise. Change actually is a little bit for the better, and you didn't necessarily anticipate it, but it kind of worked out in your favor. I'm going to tell you here coming up why we may be looking at an example of that here in college football right now, and I want to use some news from yesterday to help us get there. Let me start, though, with just sort of the straightforward facts about this. We had kind of an interesting flurry of announcements from Georgia recruits last night committed to Georgia, and yet ultimately deciding to stick with Georgia and essentially kind of shut down their recruitment. I'm going to show you this graphic on the screen here for a moment. All of this coming from, y'all know who Hayes Fawcett is, working for the national website On3. He gives us first from Brady Marchese. That's the wide receiver from Cartersville. Recruitment shut down. You get Jordan Smith, defensive back from Houston County. Recruitment shut down. You get Justice Fitzpatrick, cornerback, obviously St. Thomas Aquinas High School down in South Florida, one of the top prospects in the nation, top cornerback prospects in the nation. Recruitment shut down. So you had three big announcements coming in kind of successive fashion. Marchese, Smith, Fitzpatrick, all of them shutting down their recruitment, all of them seemingly ending overtures from other programs. Let me kind of bounce through all three of these stories here just for a moment. In the case of Brady Marchese, that's the Cartersville wide receiver, I would say that some Georgia fans have been trying to figure out, okay, well, exactly what does Georgia have in Marchese? He has probably had a lower profile as a recruit than some of the guys we talked about, class of 2025, some of the guys we are talking about, class of 2026, compared to, like, say, a Vance Spafford or someone like that. Marchese's had a slightly lower profile. And so some Georgia fans, in response to that lower profile, have been wondering, okay, well, what is he? What is this? Who is this prospect? And I would say that sometimes the best indication of what kind of prospect you are is related to the pursuit you're getting from other places. And so the reason why the Marchese news kind of pops out yesterday is because it certainly sounds like if you've got ear to the ground, online chatter, people who know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, one of the things you'll see is, boy, there was a big push for Marchese from other programs. Some of that from within the SEC. Some of that, I guess, Michigan, the other major factor here on this. It certainly seemed like that Marchese might be wrestled away from the Georgia class and end up somewhere else. And if you want to know the value of a recruit, all you really need to know is how hard are other programs working to get this guy. A lot of programs working very hard to get Marchese, but now they can just stop because Marchese let it be known via social media yesterday and the national website, no, my recruitment is shut down. If you're a Georgia fan, I think you should take that as good news. Same for Jordan Smith. We think that Smith is a really interesting prospect. Big guy, not really listed as a cornerback right now. I mean, not being a scout, of course, but just my rudimentary understanding of football would lead me to believe, hey, maybe Jordan Smith turns into a cornerback at some point in time. He's already a nice prospect, even if he's a safety. If, though, with the speed that we're led to believe that he has, the size that we can measure and recognize that he has, there's a chance he could also make that transition to cornerback. And if he does that, well, his value as a prospect skyrockets. He had other official visits that he was going to take, but now he's not taking them. And once again, when you've got, programs, down here in the South pushing that hard for a guy like Smith, the fact that Georgia's able to convince Smith to shut it all down, not take any of those official visits, boy, you kind of like the idea of putting the hay in the barn here on this and kind of closing off that possibility that maybe he might go somewhere else. And with Marchese and Smith making the decisions they made, I would say that the headline in all of this ends up being Justice Fitzpatrick making the announcement he made yesterday for the simple reason that he is the highest rated of this trio of recruits. He had just committed to Georgia. And then was it Monday show? These days just run together. I think it was Monday show where just fresh off the commitment, all of a sudden now you've got the possibility, well, he's actually going to take a visit to Ohio State. And that gets everybody all kind of worked up. And, that kind of leads to sort of the frustrating situation we're actually going to talk about more here in just a moment. But the fact that so quickly after that about face, and we told you on the show, I said, hey, listen, he says he wants to take the visit to Ohio State. Perhaps he does. If he does take that visit, it very well may not be good news for Georgia. But we also said that we would expect Georgia to work very hard to convince him not to take that visit. And it seems like that has worked. So going to visit Ohio State. Who knows what happens if that takes place. But now apparently you don't have to worry about that anymore. That is also a recruitment shutdown. Now, what is going on when you get three announcements like this in somewhat successive fashion? Well, here's where I'm going to make a little bit of an uneducated guess, not inside information, but I'm guessing most of you will probably agree with my educated guess. In fact, you probably guessed something similar yourself, that somehow, some way, a lot of this is probably related to new landscape, post-house settlement, what Georgia can pay, what Georgia can do, how Georgia can secure this via signed paperwork, things like that. And the promise of an offer that, well, if you want to visit, we may also have to look at our options here too. You don't know for a fact that conversation took place, but you can certainly imagine how some of those conversations might unfold. And so when you hear, recruitment essentially over and shut down for Marchese and Fitzpatrick and Smith, you're led to believe, well, perhaps somebody sort of signed something here and Georgia through its own compensation offer in the new revenue sharing world and the availability of that offer has convinced these guys to shut down their recruitment, which leads to what I believe is the unexpected benefit for Georgia fans. And this is going to sound kind of corny, and I guess I'm sort of a corny guy, but I do mean this like literally and matter of fact. So sometimes in life, if you live long enough, you will see words come to mean something different than they used to mean. This can get tracked over the course of like centuries, of course, but also over like a period of years, this happens too. Like the best example of this is probably the word literally. Do you know the word literally? Have you noticed that literally means something different than it used to mean? Like the actual functional definition for literally now is actually the opposite of its original definition. Literally is sort of a synonym for figuratively now. It didn't used to be that way, and When people use literally or overuse literally, they're probably guilty of using the word incorrectly. But I hate to break it to the grammar police. If people use it incorrectly long enough, all of a sudden that's just the way the word's used now. And we sort of see that with the word literally. Literally now means figuratively, whether you like it or not. That's a word that has a different definition, at least in its functional usage, than it used to have. Well, in recruiting, we have another example of that too. And this is like the most frequent criticism we hear from fans, and we've been hearing this, not just in the NIL age or the transfer portal age. We've been hearing this since like DawgNation started, and frankly, since I started caring about, recruiting, which was a lot longer than that. And you've heard this too. Perhaps you've even said this before. It's some version of, these kids these days, they don't know the meaning of the word commitment. That they don't know what the word commitment means because so-and-so commits to so-and-so school, but he still takes visits other places. He's still, shopping around other options, whether it be NIL age or whatever age we lived in prior to that, that it's listed as a public commitment, but to people who are like sort of very into the definition of the word committed, this doesn't really feel like committed as we've understood it. That much like the word literally came to mean figuratively, the word committed has kind of come to mean something different in college football than it previously was before. And a few days ago, it sort of seemed like Justice Fitzpatrick was the classic example of that. He had committed to Georgia, as he told, I think it was Hayes Fawcett as well, I'm ready to go to war for Georgia. But prior to that, I do want to take a visit to Ohio State. And like I said, grammar police step up and say, that's not what committed means. Well, here's the unexpected benefit of this sort of new age we live in. Because there is a now new brand of compensation that did not used to exist, coming directly from the athletic departments themselves, in order to be eligible for that compensation, we're assuming that you're being asked to sign something for that compensation. And that signature binds Georgia or whatever program to give you that compensation, but it also perhaps binds you to receive that compensation, meaning you are now in a contract with not quite an employer, but certainly a team that you're going to play on. And all of a sudden now, when we see these recruitments shut down, we can assume that there's some sort of, I'm no lawyer, but I'm assuming here, some sort of binding agreement behind the scenes that makes that so. So guess what? For those of you over the course of years who have not liked the fact that the word commitment just doesn't seem to mean what it used to mean, well, guess what? The word commitment now may actually mean something different than it did before. And that for players who really are committed may mean pen to paper. And all of a sudden now, like the word commitment may mean something more than it used to. And perhaps yesterday, the example of that from Georgia. 3 recruits reaffirming their pledge to Georgia and shutting down their recruitment going forward, going further. They are committed, truly committed. And in college football, we may actually see a little bit more of this in the months and years to come. All right. That said, let me shift gears to this. Now, I was joking with our video audience a little earlier that in lesser trained hands, this would be a topic that could steer off the rails just a little bit and provide unnecessary provocation to an audience that I have great respect for. Because what I'm going to do here for a moment is I'm going to revisit one of the most unpleasant moments in Georgia's football history, in the near term and long standing. We're going to revisit one of those moments, but we're going to do so for what I believe is an important reason. We are in an age right now of an off season where it's the summer of 2025. One of the things that media loves are numbers divisible by 10, divisible by 5. So, quarter century, 25 years, typically sort of thought of as a silver anniversary. 25's always sort of had a sort of a special thing. We're 25 years into the new century. So you're seeing a lot of, media entities sort of looking back on the last 25 years of college football. ESPN's doing a version of that. And they had their 25 biggest plays of the last 25 years. Somehow Georgia didn't have one of those. A couple of national championships, many SEC championships, regular fixture on television, somehow not one of the 25 biggest plays of the last 25 years. I don't know. Maybe that's right. Maybe it's not. It seemed a little weird to me, but perhaps that's just my red and black colored glasses viewing all of that. Perhaps that's the case. However, Georgia was on the receiving end of a couple of these big plays, including, according to ESPN, the fourth biggest play of the last 25 years is the famous 2nd and 26 touchdown, 2017 national championship, Tua Tagovailoa to Devontae Smith to win that national title and just go into the history books forever. Fourth biggest play, ESPN tells us, of the last 25 years. Let me read what they said about the touchdown here. Bill Conley writing this, saying, the national title game at the end of the 2017 season came at you in waves. Georgia dominated and led 13-0 at halftime. Alabama subbed in freshman Tua Tagovailoa and charged back to tie the score. But the Tide missed an easy field goal attempt at the buzzer. Georgia moved backward in overtime but nailed a 51-yard field goal. Tagovailoa took an atrocious sack and lost 16 yards. Bama had control but lost it. Now Georgia was about to finally topple the Tide. And then, without a timeout, with the building still buzzing, Tagovailoa calmly looked off the safeties, fired back to a fellow freshman for the most thrilling, breathless ending to a national title game in the college football playoff era. Fourth biggest play of the last 25 years, according to ESPN, going against Georgia, national championship game ends in heartbreak. Now, to be fair, we can sort of chuckle at this a little bit more now because of what has happened since then, and that's sort of the point of all of this. This is one of those things I don't think you should lose sight of. There are a lot of, whether it be college programs, professional organizations, whatever else. If you are on the wrong side of that kind of heartbreak, it could live with you for years, especially for a Georgia fan base that came into that moment a little bit tortured. They had had the heartbreak in the same town, not the same building, but the same town in 2012 against the same opponent, Alabama. It could think back to other sort of near misses where, boy, if a ball bounces this way and this happens and that happens, maybe things are wildly different for UGA. And I mean, if you're my age, and I'm about kind of the halfway point of our audience, if you're my age, you had lived through that your entire life. And yeah, it was a different coach and Kirby Smart and sort of a different, set of circumstances. But it was the still same kind of ending we had been used to seeing for as long as any of us could remember Georgia football. That for some of us, and it's hard to say this, but when you look back on that fourth biggest play of the last 25 years, that game ending in disappointment, to a degree, that's just sort of what Georgia football was for a lot of us. And so I think it's appropriate to remember, even though it's unpleasant, how big of a building block, to mix metaphors here, that moment was in the origin story of what would become Georgia football as we understand it now. And look, if you read comic books or anything like that, all the superheroes have some sort of bad moment in their history, right? Some sort of thing that, Bruce Wayne's parents died. Or, what I'm saying? Like there's always the sort of bad part of the origin story that helped build the superhero as we know them. Well, I would say that in the case of Georgia football, it has become quite a heroic program. And like any great sort of origin story for any other superhero, it begins in kind of a troubled situation. And in so many ways, Georgia as we know it now began that night, even though the memory is an unpleasant one for Georgia, because at the conclusion of that night, Kirby Smart gave a promise directly to anyone paying attention, including his own fan base, that this would be just the first of many of these kinds of games. And in future years, when Georgia played in them, they would have a very good chance of winning them. This was such a strong statement from Kirby Smart. You may not love thinking back on 2nd 26, but I'm guessing you love remembering what Kirby Smart said when it was all said and done, showing one of the strongest aspects of his leadership in one of the toughest moments that he would ever face, Kirby Smart going back to that night.
We told our team that this game wouldn't be decided by past traditions or anything else. It was going to be decided by performances that were happening on the field. And our guys performed on the field, competed. I can't say enough about the remarkable senior class. These two young men sitting next to me, they meant more to Georgia than yards. A lot of heart and soul, a lot of fire. Sonny Michel came over and talked to the group several times during the game, inspired those guys. But in overtime, we didn't finish when we had to, and Alabama did. And to give them credit, but I think everybody can see that Georgia's going to be a force to be reckoned with. I'm very proud of this team and this university, and we're not going anywhere.
Georgia's going to be a force to be reckoned with, and we're not going anywhere. I love that. And if you're watching on video, Kirby, like all of us, we just look so much younger back in 2017 than we perhaps do now. That's certainly interesting. We've lived a lot of life since then. But also you can see the hurt in Kirby's face. Like, you can see it. I mean, to get that close to a national championship, like, for those of you who know sports football history, like, Dan Marino, in his second year, gets to a Super Bowl. Am I right about this? Second year in Marino's career, gets to a Super Bowl, loses, never gets back again. There are a lot of athletes, coaches, things like that come close to tasting early success, and they never experience it again. It's possible. But Kirby Smart led through that to make sure that story wasn't his story. And when he spoke into existence, we're going to be a force to be reckoned with, and we're not going anywhere. He went to work after that, making sure that prophecy came true. And it wasn't automatic, right? 2018, 2019, 2020, those years that would follow had their share of disappointment too. But anything worth doing, you should expect it to be hard. And in life, everything feels a little bit like a failure in the middle. There's beginner's luck, there's success at the end. Almost any endeavor feels like a failure in the middle. And those middle years for Kirby Smart felt kind of hard. It felt kind of like a slog sometimes. But it was all the next chapter in an origin story that would culminate, at least thus far, with 2021 and 2022. So ESPN kind of looking back on moments and certainly highlighting one of the moments that went against UGA. But when we now know what that moment became a step to, I think the sting of that particular brand of history, I don't think it hurts nearly as bad as it used to. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. Glad you are with us. However you're getting to us here today, video, it's 10 a.m. across all platforms, radio, Athens Sports Radio, 960 The Rep, podcast, Apple, Spotify, everything else. Just happy that you are with us, and so thankful to our friends at Breda Pest Management who make it all possible for you. And the message we've been giving for a long time remains true here. In Georgia, you need termite protection. That's just one of those things you have to have. You already know that. You're working with a company. But we would say when you look at the quality of service that you're getting from that company and the cost of service that's perhaps going up for you year after year, I think you understand it's the time now to make the switch to Breda Pest Management, to put more money back in your pocket. Just for making that decision. That's what they're all about. They're going to take care of you. They're going to protect your costs. They're going to put money in your pocket, and you're going to be able to enjoy all of that. And the good news when it comes to Breda, it's not just like the termites too. It's also like the mosquitoes there as well. I will tell you that it just sort of feels like because it's rained so much, there are mosquitoes just everywhere all the time. Well, would you like to be able to enjoy your yard more in the summer, especially when you have these kind of pleasant evenings like we have had? It'd be nice to be out there in the yard and not feel like you're being chased by a pterodactyl. That'd be a nice thing. Well, when it comes to protecting your yard from mosquitoes, Breda Pest Management can do that for you there as well. We love them. Big dog fans, multi-generational track record of service. They take good care of you. They are all about all of that. And you don't get the annual increase, all that kind of stuff that you're used to getting from the company you might be working with. You don't get that when it comes to our friends at Breda Pest Management. They're going to show you how you can put more money back in your pocket for making that switch. So mosquitoes in your yard, keep the termites away, bugs, critters, anything else. Our friends from Breda Pest Management got you covered on all of that. So I want you to find them online. It's BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A, Breda Pest Management online at BredaPest.com. They're great supporters of local athletics, big dog fans, good people who are just connected to the community, been that way since 1975. So find them online, Breda Pest Management online, BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A BredaPest.com for more on that. Okay, we're glad to have you with us here today. It's Mike Griffith here coming up. We'll talk to Mike about all the new stuff that is going on in college athletics, kind of what this means for Georgia in particular. We'll get into that here coming up in just a little bit. Also, kind of some maybe serious news involving one of the biggest names in college athletics. I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on here with this, but we will tell you what we know later on in today's show as well. But prior to that, let's get ready to go around the doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And this is kind of just for fun for a minute. And for those of you who've been with, we always have, a show like ours, new listeners, new viewers kind of coming in on a regular basis. So not everybody knows sort of our long-standing traditions. But some of you who've been with us for a long time do know that for whatever reason, one of my favorite things in the world is football prospects showcasing their basketball abilities via video. Like some of this stuff throughout the years has just been amazing. For instance, Jalen Carter had some, really good basketball highlights. Outside of the world of Georgia football, like Henry Ruggs, the former Alabama wide receiver, had an amazing high school basketball highlight tape. I just love watching football players showcase basketball abilities via video. Trayvon Walker is a very good high school basketball player. This is always just really interesting to me. And so, like right in my wheelhouse, last 24 hours, one of the things that Georgia football does that I think is just an incredible, level of community involvement, really inspiring, is their work with Camp Twin Lakes. You perhaps know that. They're in Rutledge, Georgia. Wonderful camp, taking care of a lot of, young folks for, a lot of reasons and giving them opportunity to have kind of a summer camp experience. It's a really, really, I think, valuable community thing. I've been lucky enough to be there a couple times and see it firsthand. Georgia's been heavily involved with all of that. And the work that Georgia does there is really serious. We're about to not be very serious for a second, but the work that Georgia does at Camp Twin Lakes, and they don't probably highlight this as much as they used to, I don't think. And that's not a bad thing or anything like that. They just do it. But it's a really important thing that Georgia does, really kind of just in being invested in. I think a very important, part of our sort of, community outreach and the work that Camp Twin Lakes is doing. But there's also like a basketball gym there at Camp Twin Lakes. And when George was there, I think I have the story out on this, that Zachariah Branch shared this to his Instagram story. Folks saw it there, kind of got broadcast all over the world after that. Do you know the Georgia former walk-on receiver? He had some nice highlights during G-Day as well. It's Jeremy, we call him Flight Bell, Jeremy Flight Bell. Well, if you're watching on video, I'm going to let you see this. And if you're listening, I'll describe this for you. So Jeremy Bell, is that Bo Hughley that he jumps over? Is that right? So Jeremy Bell. Okay, so so this is like a dunk contest thing where it's Bo Hughley, then Lawson Lucky, and then the last guy's Christian Miller. Now, listen, Christian Miller's my all-SEC defensive lineman, so I gotta be careful having him be at the front of that line because Bell almost comes down on him. But look at this, going over Hughley, going over Lucky, and then just barely clearing it, but also going over Christian Miller too. So jumping over three guys to complete a dunk right there. Now, listen, that is a world-class highlight. It really is. And we're obviously having fun with this, and we're going to make way more of this than we probably should. But the one thing that is not to be joked about is that's the sort of dunk highlight that could be on House of Highlights or anything else. I mean, that is a major league dunk right there from Jeremy Fly Bell, and it's fun to see the Georgia players having a good time and doing all this kind of stuff. And it really does showcase the fact that Bell, despite having like no recruiting profile whatsoever, it's one of these sort of diamonds in the rough that Georgia seems to find. Like this is a guy that like really does bring a high level of athleticism. And we saw this on G-Day too. Once again, if you're watching on video, pretty pass from Gunnar Stockton, Bell finding a way to get himself open and, kind of using the athleticism we saw on the basketball court a minute ago to make a nice deep touchdown catch during G-Day. Like you're kind of reminded like, man, this really is sort of a big time athlete. Like the nickname Flight seems to fit him pretty well. And honestly, we don't have any idea of what any of this equals to in the football field. Of course, nobody knows. But when you look at what Georgia has succeeded with in the past, obviously a lot of the Georgia roster going to be built up of former 4- and 5-star college players. That's just what Georgia has a lot of. But also that roster gets populated with the less heralded recruit who had a very small recruiting profile, or in some cases, no profile at all. And in most instances, when a guy like that goes on to success, think about Jordan Davis, or the opposite end of the spectrum, a guy like Ladd McConkey, very different players, but similar situations where they wildly outperform their recruiting profile. What they had that Georgia noticed in most cases was sort of an elite trait that separated them from other players in their same category. In the case of Davis, it would have been his size. In the case of McConkey, it would have been his lateral quickness and straight line speed. He's kind of small, and sometimes small guys don't succeed, but at that speed, probably worth taking a shot on. Jordan Davis is really big, and sometimes those big guys have a hard time, controlling their weight. Boy, if he could figure that out, how good could he be? You bet on the elite trait, and sometimes it works out. We don't know what kind of football player Jeremy Bell is, but we see an elite trait. It's obviously elite athleticism, and sometimes you bet on that, and maybe it works out. This is why the work that Georgia does, whether it be Bell or somebody else this time of year, is so important. The other day, Kirby was asked about, kind of timelines for college football and the fact that if you keep the spring portal window, well, maybe then with your roster post-portal, you might, instead of having spring practice, you might in June have NFL-style OTAs, and you might work out your team that way. And as Kirby Smart pointed out, listen, we're looking for the next Jeremy Bell. We're looking for the next Jordan Davis. We're looking for the next Ladd McConkey, the next Javon Bullard is an example of that. We're looking for the next guy like that. The way that we find those guys is by hosting the camps we host during the week. That's how we find the next generation of diamond in the rough that other programs don't know about. So our June is already pretty busy because I'm trying to find my next Jeremy Bell for what he may or may not sort of turn into on the football field. In fact, let me let you hear Kirby Smart talking about that. And when you see a relatively unsung member of the Georgia football team showcasing that kind of athleticism, you sort of understand where this is coming from. Here's Kirby from just a couple of weeks ago.
But there's a large contingency that's growing now, trying to push in April, portal, maybe May, that want to practice in June, have some practices in June. I want you all to think about June for us. We have 10 days of high school camp in June. We believe in using those. Across the Southeast, we use 10 days. Some schools use 10, some don't use any. We also have official visits every weekend. So now we're going to practice our team in that same window. Something's going to suffer. Needless to say, I'm a proponent for a January, wherever it fits window. There's people saying, well, we can't get our kids in academically. Well, they're getting mid-year high school players in that same academic window. It's happening everywhere. So I'm a big believer in that. And I think that's the decision that has to be made, at least from a standpoint of SEC and bigger picture, the country. Where is the portal window? And is there two or is there one?
So the purpose of that clip is when Kirby Smart says, hey, we're given 10 camp days in June, and we're going to use them. And I think that some people kind of hear that, and I don't know they fully process what he means when he says that. When Georgia's bringing guys into camp, as they like to say, they use camp as a verb. When they're bringing in guys to camp, that's what they're looking for. They are looking for diamond in the rough talent that other programs don't know about. And Georgia is kind of burning the candle at both ends. On the front end, they're battling Alabama, Texas, Ohio State for like the elite 5-star prospects. And on the other end, they're battling like Rutgers Pitt for sort of guys in state who are either really, really fast or really, really big, but also kind of unknown because they play a long way away, or perhaps they missed a season with injury, or perhaps they grew 4 inches and nobody realizes it. Like there's all kinds of opportunities like that. And if you want your best, used to be 85 scholarships. Now it's a 105-man roster overall. If you want the best 105 you can get, you got to find some guys that nobody else knows about. I don't know that Jeremy Bell becomes one of those guys, but the kind of athleticism he possesses suggests this may be another one of those situations where Georgia just found somebody that other people miss, which would certainly be a fun thing to consider. And that is around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. Now, speaking of Jeremy Bell, it's a homegrown talent. We love all of that. And we just love things grown around our homes when it comes to the state of Georgia. Our friends from Georgia Farm Bureau feel the very same way. There has always been a deep connection in Georgia with the land. Georgia's kind of been defined by its land, its dirt, fertile soil that that grows great crops, that feeds great livestock, and all of that feeds us in Georgia and around the country, around the world. It is something to be proud of if you are from Georgia. Our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau are proud of it, and they've been serving that community, the agricultural community, our farmers, for a very long time. But the service they provide to Georgia's farmers, they can provide to you too, because they're Georgians just like you are. Agents, claims adjusters, things like that, living and working, across the state just like you are. And listen, insurance is one of those things you don't really think about, but let's face it, last few weeks we've had, storms and trees falling on houses and things like that. All of a sudden, when you need it, you want to know that your insurance agent's there for you and that they care about your situation. Well, our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau are always the home team. So when you have a troubling situation with your car or your home or anything else, they're going to be there to serve you in that time of need. So I want you to give them a call, 877-404-1050. That's 877-404-1050. You can also find them online, gfbinsurance.com. Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team for your home insurance, your auto insurance, financial service needs, life insurance, things like that. Georgia Farm Bureau is ready to work with you, so make sure you check them out today. One more time, 877-404-1050 or online, gfbinsurance.com. All right, fun day talking Georgia football. Let's keep it going right now. Let's bring on Mike Griffith here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Well, let us say hello to Mike Griffith here today, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. Mike, we're just having some fun with Georgia player Jeremy Bell, kind of a cool dunk video that we saw. And, we don't know what kind of player Bell becomes at the college level. G-Day suggests he's got some football talent here too. But the point we were making is when you look at kind of what's made Georgia, to me, one of the more underrated aspects of it is the scouting component of it. And this is one of the things you don't really – in sports, professional, college, teams don't like to reveal a lot about the special sauce with their scouting. This is the sort of thing that they like to sort of keep in-house. They don't want to give the game away in terms of how they recognize, what they see that others don't. But we see the proof in the pudding. And so when you talk about Georgia and the success that it's had – obviously, smart coaching tactically on the field, sort of basic level recruiting, getting elite 4- and 5-star prospects. But there is a through line of really impressive scouting, finding diamonds in the rough, identifying talent other programs didn't quite recognize. For instance, the world thought Jordan Davis was an offensive lineman, Georgia saw him as a defensive lineman. Just little examples like that, where I think that tells the tale of Georgia's success almost as much as anything could.
Yeah, Kirby's kind of got a model for all these different positions and how he thinks, they should look and how big they should be or how fast they should be or how tall they should be. I don't know what
we
just
got
happened.
you. Yeah, we got you.
Sorry about that, Brian.
No, yeah, we got you.
And I think when they have these camps that Georgia runs, I think that really gives them an up close look. And I think Georgia does a really good job of getting to see these players up close and personal. And like you said, being able to maybe evaluate the personalities. And so I think that Kirby has this concept of what he's looking for in a player, what position, and how they might work out, and he can see that earlier maybe than others because he's done this so many times in so many places.
Yeah, it's also one of those things too where it's like, okay, so we highlight when a McConkey or a Bullard, or I mentioned Jordan Davis, when those guys succeed, we obviously, highlight all of that. Your batting average is never going to be 1,000. You may not even bat 500. Like I'm sure that Georgia's brought in all kinds of sort of 3-ish star or below guys, walk-ons in some cases, who they thought might also pan out. It doesn't always work out. I mean, I can even think around the SEC of, well, so-and-so is a world-class speedster. They're going to try to make him into something, and sometimes it just doesn't work. So you're never going to bat 1,000 on your diamonds in the rough. But if you can get a few of them to pop for you, to go along with the rest of a more traditional roster of sort of 4- and 5-star players, all of a sudden now you've kind of got the roster strength that really does give you a chance to compete for a championship.
Well, and that's kind of been, like you say, secret sauce. I've always thought it was just how many different ways Georgia uses guys on defense and the multiple positions that they play, right? It adds value to the player, as we're seeing with Tate Ratledge now, getting a look at center in the NFL. But I think it also adds value to the team when you've got that ability to play more than one spot. It provides depth. Like Malachi Starks last year was able to slide over and play a little bit more star, and that enabled a guy like KJ Bolden, maybe to get more reps at safety, to work with, Dan Jackson back there. So I think Kirby's good at one, as you said, finding the players that, athletically, and I think even from a personality standpoint, right, fit positions well. And then two, teaching those players more than one spot so they can become diverse. It not only helps with the depth at positions, but it also helps them get the best players on the field. So, and I think that starts all the way back, one, the relationships that Kirby has throughout the state of Georgia that I think goes back even to his father. His father Sonny knew so many people as a high school coach, and therefore there's an allegiance to Kirby if maybe they just had a touch point with his father at some point. You see a lot of legacy coaches, or you see a lot of schools, that maybe dealt with his father or dealt with Kirby as a player or dealt with Kirby when he was a recruiter at Alabama or Kirby when he was at Valdosta. So the reach goes so far. And because of that reach, I think you get those kids in your camp and you get people out there working for you that want to send their kids to Georgia or have their kids have that Georgia camp experience. And then he has more touch points where he has more players that he can evaluate. And I think that his staff, because of the continuity, everybody understands what George is looking for. So I think that continuity kicks in a little bit too, BA, in terms of Georgia understanding what they want at certain positions and the types of kids that they want as well.
So the big news this week has been the approval of the House settlement that coming late Friday night. Now we live in that world. Revenue sharing payments to the athletes, extra scrutiny, at least in theory, on the NIL deals. And this is now. This is not sometime in the future. This is now. This is for this upcoming season. What has been your reaction to this news now that it has reached some degree of finality?
Well, I think the framework's interesting. I mean, is it rules just to have rules, or will people actually follow these rules? I mean, to me, that's the big question. I kind of, on the front end, I like the concepts and, the different measures that they have to determine whether or not these outside NIL deals are fair market value. I know that's something that you've had a philosophical thought or two on, and, whether or not that'll be enforceable, or how a third party can possibly determine this. I suppose if you can get everybody to sign off and agree on the rules, that'd be step one. I don't think we're there yet. I think there's certain states that have certain laws that have been put into place, and we'll see how all that plays out. To me, I still think it needs that congressional oversight. And I'm going to take it one step further. I think you're going to have to make the players or student athletes, however you want to call them, I think you need to make them employees. And I think the reason you need to make them employees is because I think this money needs to be taxable. And the reason I think this money needs to be taxable, keep going down this road with me, is I think the feds need to have a hand in this, right? Because once it becomes a federal matter and there's a paycheck and there's taxes to be paid, that opens up subpoena power. Now it becomes enforceable. Now the FBI can go into your bank records. Now people can know who's getting paid what, and they will track those dollars down. But right now, if we're just talking about the CSC, the College Sports New Governing Body, these people don't have subpoena power. And so they can say, well, these are the rules. And you go, yeah, so what? What are you going to do? What are you going to do to stop a booster from giving an extra $2 million outside of the $20.5 million? How are you really going to stop that? How are you really going to police that? How are you going to stop someone from sending a Venmo to a kid for $1.5 million? And maybe Venmo's a bad example, that's trackable, but how are you going to stop someone from delivering that money on the doorstep right now? Well, if it becomes a matter of federal income tax, there's people that are paid to police that can track those dollars, that can go into those bank accounts. Now, are we eventually going to end up there? I think we probably eventually will. But how many iterations of this, and how many times does this need to evolve, and how many frameworks need to fail? Because you can put all the rules in place that you want, but at the end of the day, none of it matters if you can't enforce it. And I think we're still in a position where this is highly questionable of what can be enforced and what can't.
So let's game this out for a second. I don't want to lose people, but I do want to talk about what you just mentioned. Well, first of all, on the tax part of this, not to get super tedious, but the income is taxable now. It's just taxable as like 1099 as opposed to W-2. So the income is taxable now. but they will pay taxes as a 1099 contractor. But like I said, this is not tax advice. But you mentioned the idea of being employees. And that's what everybody says. And there's this big push of, hey, you got to make them employees. You got to have collective bargaining. Make them employees. You got to have collective bargaining. Let me game this out with you about why I am so against the athletes becoming employees. I don't mind them getting paid. To be honest with you, back in the 70s when it was Trans Am, things like that, I didn't mind that either. I just don't care. That's not the kind of thing I've ever been all that scandalized by. I have a fairly high tolerance for that sort of thing. Here's why I don't want athletes to become employees. Because if you're an employee, all of a sudden now you're saying, well, why do I have to go to school? Like what's the purpose of going to school if I'm a professional being paid to play football? And why do I only get 4 years? Why can't I have 8 years? And all of a sudden you are slowly, the old Hemingway line, slowly then suddenly severing all ties to what has previously been intercollegiate athletics. And I'm telling you right now, Mike, and I say this all the time, look around the country, look around the world. There is not a minor league sport anywhere that's financially solvent. They're just not. There's not a minor league sport anywhere that is to any degree successful. That college athletics is a uniquely American institution, and we don't fully understand why it works to the degree that it has, but pretty clearly somehow connecting the athleticism to the idea of a college, that just sort of works with people. And by the way, you see this beyond just football. Women's college basketball, far more popular than the WNBA. Right now, men's college basketball is more popular than the NBA. For whatever reason, you just sort of see a connection to college athletics that makes the sport more popular than it would be. So when you're employees and you let the dominoes fall after that, you run the risk of, well, pretty soon this is just a truly professional endeavor. And I think at that point in time, the popularity this sport is enjoyed, I do believe it'd be threatened. What would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. And I think part of the magic of college sports is the branding and the fact that, hey, these players represent us, right? Georgia, Alabama, Florida. They're a representation of something bigger. And I think the model is already a little bit at risk because you're saying, well, not to pick on, Georgia basketball, they're no different than anyone else. They've got a lot of transfers. This is how it is in college basketball, right? And they sent out a picture of these guys, and I'm going, oh, so these are Georgia guys now. Last year, they were all over the country at different people. I don't know any of these guys. I've never met them. I've never watched them practice. I've never seen them, play a game in a Georgia uniform. But this year, this is this year's version of what Georgia is. And you're seeing it more with football, not to that high degree. You're seeing it in baseball. What did Georgia have in baseball? 23 different transfers from 18 different schools. But it says Georgia on the uniform. All right. But people in general, fans are saying, wait a minute, these guys are free agents. This guy might be here this year. He might be gone next year. And I think that's taken a little bit of a hit. And I think we've talked about that, about how before, part of the magic of it was watching a guy get recruited, come into the program, and then be developed within the program. Wait his turn. Oh boy, he's going to be a good one when he gets out there. I saw him do some things in the spring game, and I know eventually he's going to get on the field. And I think that's still at the core of college football. But these quarterbacks, who are they playing for next? I mean, it's 4 of the last 6 national championship programs have been quarterback transfers. So you kind of wonder about, does that branding still hold, right? I've always wondered, about the NFL. I remember doing a story maybe 12 or 14 or 15 years ago. I can't recall, but there was some Tennessee, the Pac-Man Jones era. And I said, why are they the Tennessee Titans? They ought to be called the Nashville Titans. They don't represent the state. The Pac-Man Jones isn't representative of what this state's all about. Why are they grabbing the whole state name? You've got a University of Tennessee, right? This is Nashville. Right. And I wrote that philosophical discussion. Well, now who's representing your sports teams? How many of these are Georgia kids? I mean, ideally, and I know Georgia fans get excited. I think a big push for Gunnar Stockton is that he's a Georgia kid. He's a kid that holds the Georgia high school records. He's a kid that was raised in Georgia. There's a history of Gunnar Stockton with people from the state of Georgia, right? The Bobo family, right? So it's kind of all in the family kind of thing. If Gunnar Stockton had done all these things in Arkansas, I don't think there'd nearly be the push for him. I don't think everybody would be like, well, why we got this guy from Arkansas? He hadn't done anything here yet, but he's a Georgia kid, and so it means a little more. So I think that regionalism is a big part. Getting back to your question, I think that regionalism is a big part of why college sports is special and different. And we can go all the way back and look at the pro sports model and see they were primarily in the Northeast and the Midwest and the South back in the day prior to the shift in population. Didn't have a lot of professional teams. I mean, still in Alabama and Auburn, that's it. I mean, unless you like the USFL and the Birmingham Stallions, but for the most part, it's Alabama and Auburn. That's it. That's all you got. Right. But in Georgia, of course, we have Atlanta and all the pro sports teams a little bit more stratified. But to your point, I do think the model is at risk, period. And then as far as the educational part, I mean, with the online ability to do work online, I don't know if kids are just much more adept at learning online, or if other people are taking the test for them and you can't enforce it. I mean, when's the last time any player anywhere of note had to miss a game because of academics? Now, do we just think all of a sudden human nature changed and all these kids are just studying more and getting better grades, or do we think it's a lot easier to avert the system with online education? And that's a whole other can of worms.
So let me be very clear about one thing, and I hate to say this, I don't care if they go to school or not, but the fact that they're perceived as students, even if it's like cynical, I'm just being as honest as I can be.
I got it.
I don't personally care what so-and-so player's grade in English 101 is. I could care less. I really don't care. That's between him and his provost or whatever. But the perception that these players are students, even if it's kind of a charade, even if it's kind of a whatever, I do believe it positively benefits the popularity of college athletics. I just think it does. People like the idea of college athletics as a form of development. They like the idea of this is how we turn young people into men. Football makes men. I say that all the time. I do think that people like the idea of that. And if you strip that away, I think all you've got left is just the raw athleticism of it. And in other walks of life, spring football leagues, G League, minor league baseball is shrinking all over the place. It's not a viable entity right now. Corn Ferry Tour in golf, minor league sports are just not popular. And if you reduce football to a minor league sport, I do believe you'll live with the consequences, even if that seems unforeseeable. Now, let me just shift gears really, really quick in the time we have left because I've kept you long. We talked yesterday because, look, what we just discussed, that's real. That's what the landscape is. But boy, I do get the sense, and it always happens this time of year, people are ready for the games. They're ready to kind of get back to it. The point we made yesterday is sort of a simple one. The good news for a Georgia fan is, as you kind of go through this sort of summer of, hey, what's the new world look like? What are the rules now? When you get to the season, and I know you've written about this from the perspective of ESPN ranking games and things like that, the schedule that Georgia gets to play, the fact that Georgia's a point spread favorite in all of these games, Georgia right in the middle of another really, really rich set of storylines. And I just think this fall around here, whether it results in a Georgia championship or not, I think this fall around here has a chance to still be very, very fun.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, well, look at I think you mentioned it. Look at the whole, the riverboat at Tennessee, the whole DawgNation invasion there. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, you got a Georgia fan base that's going to be on a riverboat going up the Tennessee River the day of the Georgia-Tennessee game. And BA, I remember the last time we did this 2 years ago, it just put these Tennessee fans overboard, right? No pun intended, but the Vol Navy was threatening to block the DawgNation ship. I mean, so from a theater standpoint, there's no doubt. And that's a road game. Now you look at the home games. And can you imagine what the Georgia-Alabama Saturday is going to be like, or the Georgia-Texas game? I think someone was talking about when Notre Dame came in 2019, there was all these private jets flying over. It's going to be like that for Texas. So, from a theatrical standpoint, from an environment standpoint, Ole Miss and, Lane Kiffin's coming, and, there'll be some hijinks or some play that week that's going to get that game hyped up. The trip to Auburn, the unknown with Hugh Freeze, and, will they be garbage or will they be great? It could be either extreme. We don't know what's waiting at Jordan-Hare Stadium. We don't know what Alabama's going to bring in to Sanford Stadium. And if the curse continues or if Kirby conquers the Crimson Tide, they don't come here very often. I look at his record and I'm like, oh, well, Kirby's only, I say, well, he's played what? How many games has he played Alabama here between the hedges? None. Kirby hasn't gotten Alabama at home yet. It's ridiculous. So, he's going to get his first crack at him between the hedges. So, and then the storylines within the team. What's going to happen with Gunnar Stock? What is the quarterback situation going to look like? Is Gunnar going to, rise up and prevail in the end and get better week by week? Or, will there be an early stumble and another quarterback gets an opportunity? Or who knows? The running back situation. You brought in this running back from Illinois. I'm dying to see this guy compete with Frazier. And then there's, will Robinson perhaps be back? Could he come out of the woodwork and be the dominant power runner that we thought he could be before this horrible turf toe injury? The receivers, the new receivers, on paper, they look great. It's one of the best receiving core, but how does it function in the game? And does the offense change? So like you said, storyline after storyline, opponent after opponent, incredible scheduling, expectation versus the reality of the parity. The season, it can't get here soon enough. So yeah, we're all a little weighed down and reading through all the settlement and how does the restructuring work? The bottom line is I don't think it affects football, period. Not right now. You've got, the kids that are on the roster. The roster limitations don't take effect immediately. As long as the kids got a remaining eligibility, they can hold their place. So it doesn't really affect the roster. I don't think it really affects Georgia football. It's certainly not going to affect the quality of care the kids get. They're not going to have to cut anything. Other programs, they're having to cut programs. They're having to cut positions. The student experience is going to change. In my opinion, the strong get stronger as a result of this, and this is going to separate some of the have-nots. They're going to drop off. They're not going to be able to compete anymore. So I don't necessarily say it's great news for Georgia, but I don't think it's bad news. I think business as usual, and the sooner we can start getting back to these football storylines when the team practices, when Kirby and the players go to Atlanta to talk about the upcoming season, the better for me. But in the meantime, we'll continue to explain this, the lay of the land, so to speak, some of the hurdles that are still ahead, how these NIL deals will work, the $20.5 million disbursement, how does Georgia disperse that, which programs they invest in more. Some of those particulars are interesting, but I'm with you. I think this is a season of theater. This looks like to me, and you would know better than I, but this looks like about as good a home schedule as Georgia football's ever had, ever.
In my lifetime, for certain. Mike, thanks for being here today. We will talk to you soon. You're on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
I appreciate it, BA. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So let me just say one more thing here about the kind of sort of whatever about, Gunnar Stockton. How good is Gunnar Stockton going to be? As I told you yesterday, you can go to DraftKings. DraftKings is one of the fastest growing companies really in the world, certainly in America. One of the two major sports books. They have posted lines for at least 5 Georgia games. Let me focus on just one of these for a moment. Right now in November, now you couldn't bet big dollars on this, but you could bet something. Right now in November, Texas comes to Georgia. According to DraftKings, Georgia is a 2.5-point favorite in that game. And many of you know this. How do point spreads work? You typically get about 3 points for being at home. That means right now, a Texas team that I think has a really good chance of being the number 1 team in the country when the AP and the coaches poll come out. I think there's a very good chance Texas could be number 1. But the data that informs the point spreads would say on a neutral field, Georgia and Texas, about even. Maybe a half-point edge for Texas on a neutral field right now. Will that be reflective of the actual spread in November? Perhaps it's not, but that's the perception right now, and I do think that matters because the contrast here is Texas has Arch Manning, most hyped quarterback in America. Georgia has Gunnar Stockton, admittedly, not on anybody's list of top quarterback right now. To be honest and to be fair, when you look at 10 best, 20 best quarterbacks in America, you probably don't see Gunnar Stockton because of his lack of experience. You don't really see him on there. Now, Manning doesn't have much experience either, but he's obviously, got a lot of attention for all kinds of other reasons. Manning and Stockton could not be more different with their profiles coming into the season, but odds makers who don't make this stuff up out of whole cloth because their money is on the line based on the lines they set, they look at Georgia and Texas and say, about even. Neutral field, Texas about a half-point favorite, somewhere along those lines. Georgia at home, about a 2.5-point favorite. So just keep this in mind. If you want to stir the hysteria around, well, how good is Gunnar Stockton or Mike Bobo this or whatever like villain you want to pick at. I'm not picking on anybody in particular, but you know what I'm talking about. If you want to pick out any villain within the Georgia community to go after, if you want to just keep pounding Gunnar Stockton week after week after week, or if you want to pound, Mike Bobo week after week after week, just know this. Odds makers don't agree. Number crunchers don't agree. They don't. They think Georgia's going to be just fine. That doesn't guarantee a national championship, but be careful. Be careful if your level of certainty about what you think is wrong with Georgia is higher than the people who do this for a living. Be very, very careful about that. And with that, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And you know what? We love Royal Caribbean in the summer because I hear this all the time. Now, I just had my Royal Caribbean cruise vacation in April, so I'm going to be, frankly, I had a couple of them in April. So it's going to be a little while before I take a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. But I'm hearing people all the time talking about all of their great Royal Caribbean cruise vacations. And in fact, I'm hearing people already looking ahead to kind of late 2025. As you know, by the time we get to the end of the year, we're going to debut the brand new Royal Beach Club in Nassau in the Bahamas. Now, I'm going to speak right now to people who've been on a cruise vacation before. Oftentimes, I'm speaking to people who are maybe taking their first cruise vacation. Let me speak to those going on a cruise vacation for the first time. Here's what you know. If you've been on a cruise, you've probably been to Nassau. I believe that's in the Bahamas. I believe it's the most frequently visited port for all cruisers. Nassau is just sort of, the place that everybody has probably been if you've been on a cruise vacation. And there is a little bit of a vibe of been there, done that sometimes when it comes to Nassau, just because it's such a frequently visited port. Here's what I'm here to tell you. Royal Caribbean's about to change all of that. If you've ever sailed in Nassau before, you know how on the kind of the side of the port kind of closest to the ocean, there's the lighthouse, there's the little, is it an isthmus? Is that what they call it? A little isthmus, a little land bar type thing, that they are literally turning into a beach club that's going to rival Perfect Day Coco Cay and the other stuff that Royal Caribbean has built. And it's going to be right there in Nassau exclusively for those on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. To say this is changing the game, that is not too hyperbolic. So let Jessica Slater tell you how you can have this experience for yourself. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. All right, I want to get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here for a couple of minutes. I want to mention a story I saw at CBSSports.com. Here's the headline, Matt Zennett's good writer. The headline is, Auburn offensive tackle Xavier Chaplin is drawing first-round buzz after transfer, could be a breakout star for the rebuilt Tigers. Now, let me say this. Matt Zenitz is a writer I have a lot of respect for. A lot of the stories that have come out, transfer portal, things like that. Zenitz has broken a good number of stories. This is a respected writer, important place within the college football diaspora. This is kind of an important figure. I do think it's interesting, and this is not a criticism of CBS Sports, not a criticism of Zenitz. It's just something that I've noticed, and I'm curious if you've noticed the same thing. I feel like this category of story exists in a way now that it didn't used to exist. Chaplin is leaving Virginia Tech to come to Auburn, and boy, unnamed draft source, unnamed scout says this guy could develop into a first-round pick. Now, let's say for a minute that's true. If that's true, Auburn has sort of successfully then done something we would say almost nobody else does in the transfer portal. You are not finding elite offensive line in the transfer portal. No one really does that. I'm talking about in the last few years, the portal kind of being a real thing. You're just not finding elite, especially offensive tackles, in the portal. It just doesn't happen. So if Auburn has succeeded in doing that, it's a huge coup for Hugh Freeze. And whether we want that to be true or not, you would have to acknowledge, boy, that's Freeze finding some leverage that a lot of programs have just not been able to find. So let's take it seriously and say if it does work, then that's really Freeze getting over the rest of college football. But the flip side of this is, if we use the recent track record as our guide, somehow the praise for Chaplin is perhaps overstated. Not because then it's as poorly reported the story or because CBS has had a sort of a bad premise for an article. Just it's just a prediction that turns out not to be true. And it's not my point to sort of hammer that part of this or anything else. I just want you to be on guard for this right now. And by the way, I think you've even seen some of this with at least one or two of the guys that may have landed at Georgia too. I think you've seen some of this is not just a thing that kind of goes one direction towards programs we don't like. This also maybe kind of comes our direction with players that we do like and we do hope succeed. I think because this is my hypothesis, whether it's true or not, you can determine for yourself. I think because we have this new sort of silo of involvement in college athletics from like sort of the player representative ranks, I think you're seeing a lot of hype for transfers in a way you didn't used to see. And it always kind of goes along the lines of, you've never heard of this offensive tackle, but he may become a first-round pick. Or you've never heard of this edge rusher prospect, but he may come and lead the SEC in sacks. There's this new level of hype for transfer players. 3 weeks ago, nobody had heard of him, but now he's the player that everybody wants. And in some cases, some of this may be true. And certainly the sources for these stories are saying that it's true. But I do kind of wonder how much of this is sort of coming from the sort of player representative ranks where there's a little bit of an incentive to sort of hype up your own guys a little bit. You're sort of stable. It's like you're sort of stable of guys. There's a little bit of an incentive for that. Like, how like if you follow like the big NFL news breakers, there's a lot of stuff that just sort of feels like you can kind of trace this back to where it came from. I just feel like there's this new thing in college athletics where, boy, there's a lot of praise for so-and-so transfer that wasn't famous at all. Like during the fall when we were actually playing games, nobody was talking about so-and-so player. And as I said before, there's even some of this around the Georgia program. I'm not trying to say this only goes towards Georgia's rivals, but it just sort of feels like there's some of that that's out there right now of, like where is this sort of newfound praise for this, previously unfamous player? Watch that and see if you don't notice more of that in the future, whether that's fair or not. On a more serious note here for a moment, ESPN is reporting, I'm going to read straight from the headline. Source says Colorado's Deion Sanders is dealing with an unspecified illness. I don't quite know what to make of this, but I think the thing that demonstrates this is at least potentially serious is, as Heather Dinich writes, that Sanders has been in Texas, obviously not in Colorado where he's the coach of the Buffs, dealing with what's being called an unspecified health issue. And you've got, we talked about Georgia camping and doing all that kind of stuff. Well, you've got stuff going on at Colorado too right now, like the same kind of camps, I guess. And Deion is not there for them. So I'm guessing we hear more about what this is. I know some of Deion's sons, I don't know, like Shador Silo, Deion's other son, I believe it's Deion Sanders III, I think that's his name, has kind of acknowledged there is a little bit of a health issue, but I believe he's also said that he thinks that Deion is fine. And in fact, it's Deion Sanders Jr., I should say, was on a live stream on YouTube, says that Deion is feeling well. So obviously some sort of acknowledgement. Apparently there is a health concern here, but right now it's short on details. So I would say keep Deion in your prayers. Maybe this turns out to be not all that significant, but it's at least significant enough right now that Deion is in Texas as opposed to Colorado as a summer of work for the Buffaloes kind of takes place here. Let me also mention that, Michigan is sort of back in front of the NCAA again. There's at least some chance that Sharon Moore, who will be suspended for a portion of this season for his involvement in the previous sign-stealing fiasco, that suspension could be increased. There was reporting at the end of last week that Connor Stallions was there for this NCAA investigation. I mean, honestly, all of this from the NCAA has been pretty toothless in recent years. My guess is they don't have any real power to do anything of real significant note to Michigan. But it does give me a chance to sort of re-rack something I've said before. I do believe the sign stealing issues that Michigan faced in 2023, I do believe they were real. I do believe that Michigan benefited from it. I don't have the capacity to be able to tell you that's the sole reason they won the national championship or even the main reason they won the national championship. But I do believe, based on the information I have, is that Michigan was aided by cheating in a season in which won the national championship. And thus far, they've mostly kind of gotten away with it with only slaps on the wrist. I don't think the story's received enough coverage. I don't think it's gotten enough scrutiny. And I do think it's more real than it's been given credit for. So we're going to follow more of this. I do think it's a dark cloud that should hang over the Michigan program because there hasn't been sort of proper admission of all of this yet. Harbaugh's gone. The president is gone. There's just been a lot of movement to sort of kind of lessen the need for any kind of real evaluation. But I do believe this was real, and Michigan's still being investigated by the NCAA over that. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And before we get ready to say goodbye to you here today, let me also give a shout out to our friends at Dr. Pepper. Now, y'all know I love Dr. Pepper. Here's something else I also love. I love summer blockbuster movies. I'm being serious here. And I love the fact that, I grew up in the era of like, hey, we're going to have a tie-in with the big blockbuster movie. Well, you've got some of that going on with Dr. Pepper right now. And the outstanding summer movie Jurassic World Rebirth. It's a new era of flavor for Dr. Pepper. It's the Dr. Pepper Blackberry. And it's the Dr. Pepper Blackberry Zero Sugar, of course. It's a one-of-a-kind collaboration. So if you're excited about summer movies, the next iteration in the Jurassic Park universe, and the great one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper, this is a great summer to enjoy all of that. So make sure you check it out today because when it comes to Dr. Pepper and DawgNation Daily, it's a pepper thing. And as we say goodbye to you here today, there's been some talk as of late about our guy Nick Chubb signing a new contract post-injury with the Houston Texans. We wish him well there. A classy gesture here, though, from the Cleveland Browns. And you don't say that a lot in life when it comes to the Browns, and especially in this case because we're talking about Browns owner Jimmy Haslam, who many of you are aware is also a very big Tennessee booster. So Haslam, not necessarily our favorite guy, typically speaking, but an incredibly classy gesture here on social media. The Browns releasing a statement, Mr. Haslam and his wife, saying, I want to take the opportunity to thank Nick Chubb for all he's done for the Cleveland Browns, bragging on him and concluding the message by saying, thank you for being a Brown, Nick. We look forward to the day we celebrate your career as a member of our Ring of Honor. So it takes a lot for us to praise a big Tennessee booster, but in this case, we're actually going to give a golden shoe to Jimmy Haslam for showing some love there as he appropriately should to Nick Chubb. That's our golden shoe for today. Lousy, stinking Gators. About 1,677 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised. The price is promised. You can trust them on all of that today. Hope you're doing well. We are not going to go crazy long here today. I got a couple things I got to do today, so we're going to bounce out of here in just a little bit. I will take some comments, though, and see how people are doing. Let us see what else. Let us dive in here. Chef Jay Bowen, complimentary of Gunnar Stockton. Yeah, I mean, the point we've made about Gunnar continually is we think that Gunnar Stockton, in all likelihood, is going to be a regular Georgia starting quarterback. The kind of guy that, just sort of fits somewhere within the statistical realm of what a typical Georgia starting quarterback could be. Usually is. And we think for Georgia that's probably fine. I would say that some of the stuff around Gunnar has probably been just a little bit unfair. I do. I think it's been unfair. And we have played defense against this from the very beginning. For instance, after the SEC championship, when some of the people, including, pretty loud vocal critic, when at the time they were like, oh my gosh, Gunnar Stockton's the savior, and Gunnar Stockton's going to put Georgia in his back, and Gunnar Stockton's going to beat Notre Dame all on his own. There was a lot of that post-SEC championship. If you will remember, one of the things we try to be very careful of around here is we try to make sure that we don't say things that need to immediately be backtracked upon, that we need to be immediately retracted. And so what we warn people of is, hey, be happy about what Gunnar did for you in the SEC championship, but let's not put too much on a guy now making his first start. Well, guess what? Some people put too much on Gunnar Stockton making his first start, making it sound like that game was going to be easier than it was. And that's just kind of how it goes. There's this like ritualistic exercise of let's build a guy up for the sole purpose of then being able to sort of tear him down. And we just try not to participate in that news cycle. We really do. We said post-SEC championship, what Gunnar gave Georgia was invaluable that day. And then he will also be a guy making his first start in the Sugar Bowl that we expect him to be capable, but it wasn't going to be some sort of magic trick style performance. That's basically the way that it works out. We feel the same way now of it's appropriate not to rank Stockton near the top of returning SEC quarterbacks or starting quarterbacks around the country because he's played very little. Now, that doesn't stop people from ranking Arch Manning very high. We've seen some love for Austin Simmons too, the Ole Miss quarterback. But putting that aside, I think it's totally appropriate not to have Stockton near the top of your quarterback list because he has played very little, and his profile as a quarterback is just lesser than some of the guys he could be competing against. That's all quite true for us. But as we've been trying to make the point of throughout the entirety of certainly the summer, if not the entirety of the offseason, that I think it is a lazy take to make the 2025 season some sort of referendum on Gunnar Stockton. I just think that's the case. Because if the Georgia offensive line is better, and if the Georgia running game is upgraded, and if these new playmakers, the Georgia wide receiver core, turn out to be as advertised, and if the defense can, kind of return to form, especially up front when it's how it limits the opponent running game, you get the point here when I go on and on and on. If this happens, if that happens, if this happens, if that happens, then Georgia starts to feel like Georgia again. And when Georgia really feels like Georgia, the end result of that is a quarterback who's just sort of one of the things among an ensemble that is going well. And even in the case of Stetson Bennett, who kind of goes down as a historic figure and became really famous by the time his Georgia career ended, honestly, when he's playing at Georgia A, he dealt with a bunch of unfair stuff too, kind of knucklehead type takes. But B, Georgia at its best, even though now Bennett's remembered as a historic figure, for the entirety of that 2-year run, Bennett was one of the good things that Georgia had going on. Even in 2022, in his Heisman finalist year, Bennett was still among the many things that you liked about Georgia in a season like that. And by the way, it's not just Georgia that functions that way. Have you noticed, and I'll get back to comments after this, have you noticed that college football sort of also functions that way too? That the Joe Burrow, Babe Ruth style quarterback, having the sort of unbelievable season, leading his team to a championship in the process. Y'all, that was 6 years ago. And we haven't seen that level of quarterback play for a national champion since then. We just haven't. That the Burrow, story, guy who becomes the number 1 overall pick and sets record with his stats, and then team wins the championship because of that. During that period of time, we were told that's what you have to win a national championship. We correctly called that out for what it was at the time. And really, since then, there hasn't been any replica of that. There just hasn't been. Even for a guy like, we've said over and over, Will Howard, 6th-round pick. But even the year before that, look at J.J. McCarthy, who did become a 1st-round pick, but was he playing for the Vikings? There are a lot of people up in Minnesota who are like, I'm not quite so sure that McCarthy's really the guy here. Even he's not the kind of game-changing quarterback. And then, of course, it was Bennett for 2 years prior to that. Jonathan Aaron mentions the Tennessee riverboat. We have not officially announced any plans for that. Every now and then the gun gets jumped. We have not officially announced any plans for that, but you never know what may go down there on that. You never know what may happen. Let us see what else. Paul Moon says Gunnar Stockton played well when asked, but it's a tiny sample size. Thinking about it from a statistical standpoint, any success or failure from that amount of data could be entirely from random noise. I would say to a degree that's true. Certainly looking at a third and fourth quarter against Texas and then trying to extrapolate that into I've seen enough to know this guy's going to dominate Notre Dame, that would have been a foolish opinion. Some made it, but that would have been a foolish opinion. I think that what you can take from 6 quarters against 2 playoff teams, here's what you can take. Gunnar Stockton was not overwhelmed by the moment. He just wasn't. He handled it fine. And, I mean, I remember being at Media Day in New Orleans, prior to all the crazy stuff that would then happen later on that week when the crazy thing was, oh, can you believe this guy's about to make his first start and he drives an old pickup truck and things like that. Like the world descended upon Gunnar. He handled it just fine. He handled it fine. Was not overtaken by any of that. Seemed to navigate that pretty well. That was not a huge deal for him. It did not seem. And I was impressed by that. So you're right. If you try to make a statistical projection on 6 quarters of football, you would be just as likely to be right as wrong. That's absolutely true. But if you try to project how Gunnar's going to feel at the quarterback position, what's it going to feel like to watch him out there? I think the circumstantial evidence you have, Gunnar Stockton's going to, I think, increase your confidence in him and in Georgia by how he carries himself. I mean, keep in mind, is that Georgia knows the inner workings of all of this. Georgia has not flinched. They didn't flinch about putting him in the game. They haven't flinched one moment since then. Kirby Smart laughed at Feinbaum the other day about this idea that Georgia's not fine with Gunnar Stockton. You don't typically laugh about things that you have self-conscious concern about. My continued message is I think that Georgia's probably fine with Gunnar. I think that if Gunnar is about the median quarterback in the SEC, could be better. But if he's about the median quarterback, if he's somewhere around the 7th best quarterback in the SEC, Georgia could easily win the national championship. Like the bar is just not that high. It's just really not. It's just really not. Even for like Carson Beck, who's going to Miami for millions of dollars. Beck was like 7.9 yards per attempt last year. He was like 24 touchdown passes in 2023. Y'all, like, look at the numbers. It's actually not even that hard to match the statistics that Beck put up. And, I think that Beck has a higher profile as a quarterback than Stockton does. But there is a statistical profile of 2 years worth of starting for, Beck at Georgia. And, no matter what sort of, attribution you make for why it was, the numbers themselves were not amazing. And not necessarily impossible to replicate. DT on the subject of the golden shoe said it would fit nicely on a shelf right below the DawgNation logo. Yeah, maybe so. Maybe one of these days we can do that. UGA Marine on the subject of how Michigan from a PR standpoint handled the NCAA stuff. Yeah, I mean, here's the one thing I think that Michigan rightly understands. Power means never having to say you're sorry. And what, in this case, Power did, Michigan being a powerful member of a powerful conference on both the athletic and the academic side. Michigan as a, prestigious state university throws a lot of weight around. And they essentially dared somebody to do something about it. They essentially bet that no one would really do something about it. Now, it is not, they haven't come out of this completely scot-free. For instance, the president doesn't have a job anymore. And, there's a lot more going on there than just sign stealing. But so it hasn't been a complete, kind of, clean break from all of this, but it has essentially been, we're powerful. This is what we want to do. We'll be celebrated as conquerors. We're just going to do what we want. And for the most part, it worked. Savannah Bryan talking about one of the outlets ranking Texas 1, Georgia 2, Florida 3, for the Oklahoma 4 for the upcoming season. So there you go. The more obscure the ranking provider, the more likely the rankings are to be a little bit wonky, I would say. Bill Camacho says Sanford Stadium's going to be loud and proud this upcoming season. I would agree with you on that, Bill. I think you're going to be right about that. Johnny Prescott says, speaking of loud vocal critics, glad the mind-numbing Bobo hate is calmed this summer. Yeah, and look, you could have sort of set your watch to this, because what you see is that when you are a long way removed from the season, you are also a long way removed from any kind of like sort of feedback. And what you find out is, as you get closer to the end of the summer, kind of in the sort of the heat of the summer right now, we have some legitimate feedback. We have, and not everybody cares about this stuff, but it's out there. You've got ESPN SP Plus, you've got ESPN FPI, you've got point spreads, you've got, other various power ratings. And all of these power ratings still rank Georgia very highly, very highly. So I think one way or another, what people start to conclude is that, well, if I am out here like, polluting the air with all my negativity about Georgia, it becomes a little harder to do that when you stop getting confirmation from people outside the program that's true. You start to doubt yourself at least just a little bit, and there'll be even less. Look, it always happens. People just spew hot takes during this time of year in the hope that it'll all be forgotten by the time the actual season comes. And they try to weasel out of what they may or may not have said. There's just, and that's been going on now for years. Trust me. And this will happen again. We talked about Gunnar Stockton a moment ago. If Stockton is fine at quarterback, some of the same people are constantly polluting the air with their, stuff. We'll be like, I never said any of that. I was always whatever. Just some new thing will be made up, but it's all just made up. Let me get a Facebook here just for a moment. Let's see what else. On Facebook, Bill Sanders laughing about Florida being ranked third in that other ranking we just mentioned. I think the commenter said that came from SB Nation, which I'm actually surprised even still is around. I don't see that, I just didn't know it was still around. So like I said, the more obscure the ranking, the more wonky the rankings. That may be the thing. Ken Holcomb says, I think the Gunnar Stockton is going to do fine with an above-average offensive line. It's wait and see at this point. Lots of youngsters this season. Yeah, it's a youngish roster for sure. A lot of this does come down to the offensive line, as it so often does. But, it's just kind of worth noting that you don't have to look very far to find individuals who question Georgia. And listen, these individuals may be right. I'll give you a perfect example of this. Do y'all remember summer of 2023? We sort of do what we do. Like a guy like, say, Reese Davis that year. Davis was doing podcasts, and he was like going all over the place, making a prediction for Michigan to win the national championship. And our shtick is, especially coming off 2 straight national titles, we kind of put Reese Davis in our crosshairs and made a big deal about that. Well, guess what? Davis turned out to be right. And on this show, I believe we gave him credit for being right. Herb Street that year, kind of the same thing. He was like, boy, this is the kind of year when you sort of overlook Alabama and they make you pay for it. We thought that was a dumb take because he had made the same take like 2 years in a row. But you know what? Alabama beat Georgia in the SEC championship. To a degree, Herb Street was kind of right. we had to give them a little bit of credit for that. So when we've gotten it wrong, we've tried to own it. We try to stay consistent with our opinions and admit when we've kind of overplayed a hand. That was an example when we did. But counterexamples notwithstanding, individuals can say whatever. And there'll always be some sort of individual somewhere, sort of spewing some sort of hot take about something. And there's very little recourse. There's very little accountability for any of that. What you should take comfort in, though, is that the collective wisdom of crowds typically doesn't support that. Georgia, when the human polls come out, multiple people voting and expressing opinion, Georgia's going to be top 4, Georgia's going to be top 5, which is about where they need to be to kind of get where they want to go. And we'll see during the actual season if Georgia achieves that or not. We'll see. But just notice the difference between, hey, here's one guy with a platform spewing whatever in the attempt to perhaps get attention, which we all to a degree want. And here is this, august body of experts sort of expressing a collective opinion. Just notice the difference between the two. All right. DT says, well, the offensive line developed quickly by the Tennessee game and then hosting Alabama. That's the biggest storyline to me. Yeah, I think you're right about that. We've said this a lot, that September is huge for Georgia. If we believe a loss is essentially guaranteed and 2 losses are even probable, then the longer you go without sustaining those losses, the better you are. Road game at Tennessee, home game in Alabama over the course of a 3-week span, that's huge. Having your offensive line gelled for those games is a really big deal. This is why, having a guy like Micah Morris, who's played a lot of football and certainly been on the team a lot, could prove to be really valuable. The experience that Drew Bobo got last year, that could prove to be really valuable. The fact that, both Green and Freeling have also played snaps, that could be really valuable. You've probably got, if I had to guess, a right guard who's played very little football, but the experience of those other 4 could really help. And keep this in mind. And some of this is sort of beyond my ability to understand it, but people more intelligent than me have tried to explain it, that some of the issues that you saw related to Georgia's offensive line last year, because this just sort of intuitively makes sense. 4 of these guys were pretty high draft picks. Multiple of these guys, at least, were very high draft picks. But the collective performance of the offensive line sometimes wasn't what it should have been. We're told that Kentucky game, for instance, there were some pretty serious communication issues. Now, what exactly does that mean? How specifically did that show up? Like I said, I don't pretend to be smarter than I am when it comes to stuff like that, but people smarter than me have told me that. So therefore, just sort of keep that in mind here this year, is that, hey, maybe that's like a lot of this falls in the center, Drew Bobo, coach's son, experienced player. Hey, maybe he sort of steps up from a communication standpoint, and loud stadium, and you're pointing in all these directions, you're identifying like the mic and all that kind of stuff they have to do. Maybe they're just better at that this year. And if that be the case, NFL talent gelling better together, maybe that increases the overall performance of the offensive line. Okay, we're going to get ready to go. Rambo says Gunner needs to play within his skill set, not run upfield looking for a linebacker to spear. If you do watch the video, and I've watched it several times, he does lower his shoulder a little bit before that. I think it's a defensive back from Texas. I think it was the safety that came over and laid the lick. And listen, I love Gunner. I'm proud of Gunner. He's my man. He's my quarterback. I'll get the T.O. tear in my eyes and saying that's my quarterback. I'm a big fan of Gunner Stockton. Can't wait to see him this fall. You don't need to lower your shoulder in a situation like that. You just don't need to. And you can see now, maybe that was him kind of bracing for the hit as opposed to trying to like run the guy over. And it is as tough as anything I've ever seen. The fact that he held onto the football, kept the drive alive, that's what allowed Georgia to win the game. He can't be taking hits like that. He just can't. You can't take that hit. You got to find a way to minimize that contact a bit. I would imagine, we didn't see him run very much in the Sugar Bowl. So I would say it's still a mystery of how much he will run this season. He's not like Stetson Bennett in that way. Probably not quite as quick laterally as Bennett was, maybe. So I think it's still somewhat of a mystery of how much Gunner actually will run. Jake Fromm has told us in the past he didn't think he would run all that much. When he does run, you can't bowl guys over because that is just not going to work. Because he's not the biggest guy in the world. DT says he thinks that Bama is more important than Texas. He says Texas may be the more historical type game. I would agree with that. I think that Alabama is Georgia's most important game right now. I do think that's true. Chef Jay Bowen wants the Eddie origin story, so we will finish with that here in a little bit. Let me get something else before we get there. Let me go back to Facebook. Try to one more time before we get there. On Facebook. Can we get there? Back on Facebook one more time. Brian Whitaker checking out. Brian, appreciate you being here. Jim Blair says offensive line will be good, and if we can run better, it helps passing downs and helps on passing downs and helps the passing game overall. Yeah, I mean one of the biggest things that you want to do is you just want to avoid passing downs, and this is a hard stat to like keep track of, but like you'll sort of never know how many third downs you didn't have because of what you did on first and second down. You know, you can convert on first and second and not face third down. Like you can do that. And like when you look at why Georgia's scoring was down like a year ago, I think some of what you point to is there were drives that just never quite materialized because you weren't getting the easy rushing yards that made either third down non-existent or third down more manageable. I think that's true. Like the bet that Georgia's making is a more potent rushing attack and better offensive weapons to throw to makes the job of a first-time starting quarterback a little easier. And when you put it in those terms, doesn't that sound reasonable? Like, doesn't that sound just reasonable? Of course that could be true. Better running game, better weapons. Hey, it's a first-time quarterback, but it's a slightly easier job than otherwise could be. That just seems really reasonable to me, and that's sort of the bet that I believe that Georgia is making. All right. So here's the origin story on Eddie. We talked about origin story of the Golden Shoe yesterday. Origin story for Eddie is this. And I'll even give you the behind the curtain thing about this. So way back summer of 2018, I guess it would have been. Dan Mullen's the Florida coach. Mullen was going around rubber chicken booster club meals, things like that. He talked about Georgia winning the SEC. He was asked about that. This is at a time in which Florida still thought it was a superior program to Georgia. And Mullen said, well, even a blind squirrel can find a nut. We'd been doing Gator hater countdowns for about 2 years at that point. Georgia had just beaten Florida for the first time. Mullen was a very easy figure to kind of make into a villain on the show. So when he said even a blind squirrel can find a nut about Georgia winning the SEC, that sort of turned into the blind squirrel as we know him. This stuffed animal was one of my kids' stuffed animals. Now, my kids are older now, a 13-year-old, 10-year-old. They were younger at the time. And they were actually mad that I took the stuffed animal. This is a true story in our house. They were mad that I forget if it was my son or my daughter. I honestly don't remember. It would have been my son, I guess, because my daughter would have been almost too young to care. Mad that I took the stuffed animal to become the mascot on the show, made him blindfolded. For a long time, Eddie had the Gator hater sign. Now he has the $1 million bill, and one of these days we're going to find out more about why it is that Eddie keeps the $1 million bill. That is coming one of these days. But that just sort of took off. Big deal. We've even had like an Eddie mascot make appearances at events years ago. I haven't done that in a long time, but we have done that before. That was a thing that we've done. And it just sort of became a thing around here. Now, part of the reason this still lives on is I like the idea of having, this is going to seem very pretentious, and I apologize for this. I like the idea of having some IP that we control. In other words, it's like, Eddie is sort of our thing that we did. It's not IP that we've borrowed from something else, and so therefore we have sort of limited usage for. Like Eddie is sort of our IP. We invented this. It's our thing. And I sort of like having a mascot like that that's sort of specific to us. So that's one of the reasons why Eddie has lived on, as I sort of felt like, in addition to kind of the fun backstory about what Dan Mullen had said was, it sort of met a need that I felt like we had for some like independent IP. And sort of that's what that, just to be honest, that's sort of part of the origin story around all of that. And the reason why his name is Eddie is also because when Dan Mullen was the Florida coach, a lot of people, and many of you know this, a lot of people have always said he looks like the Randy Quaid character from the Christmas Vacation, like the National Lampoon Vacation movies, Christmas Vacation in particular, Cousin Eddie. And so when we announced that the blind squirrel's name was Eddie, it got kind of an immediate laugh at the time. People kind of got the joke. Oh yeah, Dan Mullen looks like Cousin Eddie, and they obviously do bear a strong resemblance. Now, ironically, yeah, there you go. Very strong resemblance, Eddie and Eddie. And by the way, now Dan Mullen actually lives in Vegas, sort of furthering the, I guess, the tie-in to Eddie from the Griswold movies. And so people kind of immediately got that joke at the time. And so now Eddie's just sort of a thing. Like really the Dan Mullen era is now 5 years old. We hadn't been in the Mullen era in quite some time. So a lot of this is sort of bygone in the past, but the Eddie name was easily understood and easily recognizable, kind of a cheap laugh, which we're not afraid to cultivate at the time that it happened. And so Eddie's another one of those things of, hey, you can make a case. Maybe it's time to invent some new IP and some, tell some new stories. But we're going to keep re-racking this one for a while, I think, as long as there is some life to it. So that is where Eddie came from. It's an old quote from Dan Mullen. It's essentially sort of a double neg against Mullen. And Eddie sort of lives on as the mascot of DawgNation Daily in the real form here on the desk each and every day. All right. And by the way, Foster Moss remembers this too. I promised sort of an early departure. Now it's 11:42, but Foster also remembers too, is that the relationship we had with Mullen actually predates his time at Florida. And like people forget. And I'm so glad that Foster remembers this. He says, I remember they hyped Mississippi State when Dan Mullen came here in 2017. It's so true. Y'all, Georgia playing Mississippi State, was it like 2 weeks after having beaten Notre Dame on the road. Georgia was less than a touchdown favorite that day at home against Mississippi State. Very first play of the game is the flea flicker to Terry Godwin. Georgia ends up winning like 37-3, but we had endured a whole week of Mississippi State was the trendiest upset pick in the world. Oh my gosh, the trendiest upset pick in the world. Dan Mullins, this coach, is going to come in here and coach circles around this young upstart Kirby Smart. And Georgia ambushed him coming out of the tunnel. So yeah, Mullen was in our life way before he became the Florida coach, because a lot of us have been around long enough to remember when we were told they were going to come here and upset Georgia in 2017. Even like back then, we were dealing with a bunch of nonsense. It never changes. Army Dog also remembers the flea flicker. And by the way, following year, this is also kind of a funny part of this folklore. 2018, in another blowout win for Georgia against Dan Mullen, Mullen tried to get Georgia back on the flea flicker, and it did not work. Of all the soft targets that we have enjoyed, Dan Mullen's by far my favorite. For whatever reason, this week is going to turn into Remember When Week. Dan Mullen, we had, do you know how easy it was to kind of produce content when Mullen was the foil? Like Billy Napier is just such a non-entity that's sort of hard to kind of get anything out of him. But boy, Mullen was such a fun target, fun enemy. And then, before that, of course, there was Jim McElwain and what went on with him in 2017. which we always sort of felt bad about because the whole like shark thing was not McElwain. And I felt really bad that like he got mixed up in that. I think we actually finally learned who that was. But that shark thing was wild too, man. Golly. We've had some good times with Florida over the years. I mean, we've had some good times. All right, we got to go. Good stuff. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price promised. You can trust them on that today. Air conditioning, they'll get it tuned back up to factory fresh specs for you. Find them online, rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We're back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then.